The great hall of the alien academy was wide and bright with walls that shimmered like liquid metal, and voices of many young hunters echoing against the ceiling like a restless storm, yet all of them grew quiet. When the tall human visitor entered, for humans were rare in this place, and every young predator felt curiosity and unease. The alien teacher raised his long arm covered in scales of green and gold and called for silence. The class obeyed, because this was a day of learning and the subject was strange and full of mystery. The teacher spoke of hunters across the stars who stood proud and alone on their worlds, for strength was their pride and solitude their nature. He described how the great claw beasts of Drakkar hunted in silence, one against one, how the sleek-fanged runners of Vanar raced through red deserts alone, and how the shadow cats of Trillin stalked prey, without partner, and without pack, each hunter proving its worth by its own skill and courage. But then the teacher paused and looked toward the human, who stood near the front row. The human was not tall compared to the predators, yet his eyes were steady, and his stance calm. He had no claws, no fangs, no armor of bone, but he stood as if no fear lived in him, and the alien students felt the weight of his quiet. One of the younger predators rose from his seat. His scales glimmered with youth, his voice sharp with pride. He asked a question that none had dared to speak aloud. His words carried through the hall like the strike of thunder. Why is it that on Earth predators do not hunt alone? Why do wolves run together? Why do lions strike as a pride? Why do humans themselves gather in groups when every true hunter must stand in the silence of solitude? The hall stirred at his words. The students looked at one another, some nodding in agreement, others whispering that it was shameful for hunters to depend on help. Some eyes turned to the human, expecting a quick answer, expecting a defense, perhaps even an excuse. The teacher lowered his arm and turned toward the visitor, his voice calm, yet heavy with challenge. The human may answer if he chooses, for this is a question that has followed his kind across the stars. The human did not speak at once. Instead, he let silence spread like a dark mist across the hall. The young hunters shifted in their seats, tails twitched, claws tapped against stone. Some felt irritation, some felt rising fear, but none spoke, for the human only stared with eyes that seemed older than mountains. Seconds stretched into long moments. The silence became heavier than any roar. The students leaned forward, and their hearts beat louder in their chests. One alien hissed low, another clicked its teeth, yet still the human did not speak. He only moved his gaze from one predator to another, as if measuring each of them. Finally he stepped forward, his voice low, but sharp enough to cut the quiet. On Earth the forest does not forgive the hunter who stands alone. His words rolled through the hall and struck every ear. The young predator who had asked the question blinked in surprise and tilted his head. The meaning was not clear, but the weight of it could be felt like a stone upon the chest. The human's words spread a strange chill. No claws, no fangs, yet his voice carried danger and wisdom. The students looked to the teacher, but the elder remained still, as if he too waited for more. The human lifted his hand and traced a slow line in the air, as though drawing a picture with invisible ink. Storms, rivers, hidden dangers. He whispered, every path, every hunt on Earth is filled with risk, not only from prey, but from the world itself. One step alone can lead to death. The predators of the hall frowned. Their pride told them that a true hunter needs no one, yet the human's voice showed another truth, a truth that stirred unease in their hearts. The human then lowered his hand and let the silence grow once more. The young predators now sat still, their earlier whispers gone, their laughter frozen. They waited for him to go on, but he did not. Instead, he let the mystery of his first answer coil around them like smoke from a hidden fire. The young alien who had asked the question sank slowly back to his seat, his pride still alive, yet his eyes now uncertain. He had expected mockery or defense, but instead the human had given only a warning wrapped in strange words. The hall held its breath. The teacher bowed his head and allowed the silence to remain, for in that silence every student realized that the question was not answered at all. It had only begun, and the true answer still waited to be revealed. The silence in the hall was long and heavy, and it spread like a living thing, crawling across every seat and every corner, until even the smallest breath felt too loud to release. The young hunters shifted uneasily in their places, tails flicking, claws tapping, but no one dared to break the quiet, because the human had not yet finished his thought, and all of them knew the weight of words yet unspoken. The human stood calm and still at the center, his face unreadable, his hands relaxed by his side, his eyes slow and steady as they moved from one alien to another. Every young predator felt as if those eyes pierced through their skin and reached the place inside where pride and fear lived together. He did not need claws or fangs, for his presence carried a sharpness greater than steel. A tall student covered in striped armor scales let out a low growl, as if to challenge the silence, but his sound was swallowed quickly, and he lowered his head when the human's gaze met his. The silence had become a weapon sharper than a blade. The teacher of the hall watched without moving. He understood something the students did not yet see. He had lived many years and heard many voices, but never had he heard silence used with such power. The human had turned stillness into a storm. Finally the human's lips moved and his voice came out soft but strong. The forest of earth does not forgive the lone hunter. Those who walk alone are swallowed by night or river or foam or storm. Only those who walk together survive. The words were simple, but the truth in them struck like thunder against the walls of the hall. The young predator who had asked the question earlier leaned forward, his golden eyes burning with curiosity, yet also confusion. He wanted to laugh at the idea that a world itself could kill the hunter, but something in the human's tone stopped him. It was not a tale or a boast, it was a memory shaped into words. The human lifted his hand slowly and traced in the air as though sketching unseen pictures. Storms rising from nowhere, floods breaking the earth, forests filled with shadows, rivers that pull the strong down into darkness. He told them that on earth danger is not the prey alone, it is the sky, it is the ground, it is the unseen teeth waiting in the dark. One young alien hissed in disbelief, saying no world could be so cruel, but the human turned to him with calm eyes and said, "Your worlds are gentle compared to mine. On your worlds the hunter must fear only his prey. On mine the hunter must fear everything around him." The words caused unease to ripple through the students. They looked at each other, whispering low. The idea of a world itself as an enemy was hard for them to imagine. Their home planets had their storms, their deserts, their mountains, but none were spoken of with such dread. None had shaped predators into packs. The human stepped closer to the rows of young predators, his voice steady, yet carrying weight that pressed down on every heart. Alone a wolf starves, but together wolves bring down the elk. Alone a lion falls, but together the pride drags down the buffalo. Even the smallest hunters learn this lesson, or they vanish forever from the earth. The young predators stared. Some shook their heads, others looked down in thought. The alien who had asked the question pressed his claws against the desk, his pride wounded, yet his mind unsettled. He wanted to shout that real strength was the single claw, the single tooth, but he remembered the leopard in the earlier tale that the human had hinted at, and he held his tongue. The silence returned again, not empty, but filled with images drawn by the human's words. Shadows of forests, shadows of storms, shadows of hunters running side by side. None of the students wanted to speak, for they felt that if they broke the quiet, they might lose the picture they now saw in their minds. The human walked slowly to the great window of the hall and looked outside where the stars burned in endless night. He spoke again, his voice quieter, but sharper than before. "You call it weakness to stand with others, but on earth it is the only way to live. The lone hunter is the dead hunter, and the pack is the one that rules." The students felt the sting of those words. Some shifted with discomfort, some clenched their jaws, but none dared to laugh this time. The truth was too heavy, the idea too sharp to dismiss. The teacher raised his head and asked the human, "What of your own kind? You speak of wolves and lions, but what of humans themselves?" The hall leaned forward to hear the answer, because this was the heart of the question. The human turned from the stars and faced them, his eyes deep and filled with memory. "In the beginning we were small, we had no claws, we had no fangs, our skin was soft, our bones breakable, every beast was stronger than us. But we learned the law of the pack better than any other. We hunted together, we built fire together, we shared food and guarded each other. We were weak alone, but together we became strong." A shiver passed through the hall. The young predators imagined themselves without claws, without scales, without armor, and they felt naked and afraid. Yet the human stood before them, proof that his kind had not only survived, but reached the stars by the very law they once thought shameful. He continued, "We made signals with hands, and with eyes we made traps. From stones and branches we made spears, and fire we hunted beasts larger than ourselves, because we were never alone. Even when danger came from storm or beast or rival tribe, we stood side by side and faced it as one." The students leaned back, their pride shaken, their thoughts twisting in new shapes. The lesson was deeper than they had expected. The question they thought simple had opened a door to a truth they had never known. One young predator whispered low almost to himself, "If such is the way of Earth, then perhaps to fight one human is to fight them all." The whisper spread like wind through the hall, and many felt the same fear coil in their chests. The human did not answer, he simply looked at them, letting the silence speak again. The silence, heavier than iron, the silence that told them the truth, was far larger than the words they had heard. The teacher lowered his head in respect. He saw the truth now with his old eyes, and he knew that the lesson given this day would remain in the hearts of his students for the rest of their lives. The human then stepped back, his calm never broken, his silence still strong. The question had been asked, and an answer had begun, but none could yet see the full depth, for the human had only pulled back the first veil. The deeper truth was still waiting like a shadow behind the light. And so the silence of that hall became the memory of all who sat there, a silence that carried fear, awe, and respect, a silence that told them why no predator hunts alone on Earth. The human stood still in the center of the hall, his words already heavy in the minds of the young predators, and the silence that followed was no less sharp than a blade. The alien students shifted in their seats, some restless, some thoughtful, some proud and stubborn, but all waiting for what he would say next, because they felt that the story had only begun, and that the answer they had been given was not complete. The human took a slow breath, and let his eyes sweep across the crowd again, his gaze carrying weight that none could escape. Then his voice came out low and calm, yet filled with a power that stirred the air itself. "The law of the pack," he said, "is the oldest law of Earth. It is written not with ink or stone, but with the lives of every beast that has walked the forests and the plains. Those who obey it live, those who break it vanish." The students leaned closer, their eyes wide, their tails flicking. The human stepped forward, his words painting pictures in the air for them to see. Spoke of wolves, thin and hungry, alone they would starve, but together they circled their prey. They cut off escape, they struck as one body, their fangs guided by unity. And when the prey fell, it was not for one, but for all. Each mouth fed, each heart lived. The predators of the hall hissed low, their pride bruised by the thought that strength was not enough, that unity could be greater than tooth and claw. But the human pressed on. "Lions," he said, "lions that walk the plains of Africa. One lion alone may bring down a calf perhaps, but the pride together can strike down beasts 10 times stronger. The buffalo falls not because of one, but because of many, each lion holding its place, each lion part of the whole." A tall student with horns that curved like blades spoke with scorn, saying, "Such beasts sound weak, for true strength is shown when one hunter stands alone against the challenge." The hall stirred with agreement, and for a moment it seemed the pride of predators would rise again. But the human turned his head slowly, and his eyes fixed on the speaker, his voice still calm, yet sharper than steel. "The lone lion is soon torn apart by hunger or rival. The lone wolf is soon left behind by the cold, and the lone leopard may climb the trees, but it cannot keep its kill for long. The pack always comes, and the pack always wins." The horned student lowered his head, his words stolen from him by the quiet that followed. The others now felt a chill crawl through them, because the human was not telling tales, he was telling truths carved deep into the bones of Earth. The human raised his hand and closed it into a fist. Slowly the sound of silence filled the hall again, and then he spoke. "Alone you are small, together you are great. Alone you are prey, together you are hunters. This is the law of the pack, the law that Earth teaches every creature that dares to survive its storms, its forests, its endless dangers." The students shifted uneasily, their pride beginning to crack like thin glass under heavy weight. One young predator whispered to another, saying, "If such law is true, then even the strongest beast of Earth must bow to it. Even the sharpest fawn cannot stand against many." Together the whisper carried, and soon the hall was filled with murmurs of doubt and thought. The human did not smile, he did not raise his voice, he simply walked slowly across the floor, every step echoing like a drum. He told them of wild dogs, lean and relentless hunters, too small to stand against a leopard in strength, yet when they came together, when they ran as one, the leopard with all its pride and power could not withstand them. It leapt and clawed, but the dogs tore at it from every side until it fell alone against the many. The students fell silent again, the image burning in their minds. The human's voice pressed deeper. "Unity is the strength that Earth carved into every beast, every hunt, every tribe. You call it weakness, but it is the greatest strength of all. For the lone hunter may fall, the lone hunter may starve, but the pack never starves, the pack never falls." The teacher of the hall watched with old eyes and nodded slowly. He had seen many lessons, but none with such weight. He understood now why the question of Earth had lingered in his mind. For so long he understood why no predator hunts alone on that world, because Earth itself had taught them that unity was not choice, it was survival. The human stopped before the first row of students, his gaze moving from one young face to another, his voice softer now, but still sharp enough to pierce every thought. Imagine, he said, a storm that breaks the sky apart, lightning striking trees, rivers rising to swallow the land, beasts running in panic. What chance does one hunter alone have in such chaos? None, but together with others, with eyes watching every shadow, with hands holding every branch, with voices warning of every danger. Survival becomes more than chance, survival becomes law. The students sat still, their pride weakened, their hearts heavy with new thought. They began to see what they had not seen before, that their belief in the lone hunter was not truth, but habit, not wisdom, but arrogance, and the human's words stripped it away. One student with silver scales spoke softly, asking if all predators on Earth followed this law, and the human nodded slowly, saying yes. Those who lived long enough learned it. Those who did not vanished into memory. Every creature that endures on Earth follows the law of the pack, for Earth allows no other way. The hall was filled now not with scorn, but with quiet awe. The human had shown them a truth that none could deny, a truth that bent their pride and forced them to see the world in a new shape. The human then stood still and let silence fall once more. The silence was no longer empty, it was heavy with thought, heavy with fear, and heavy with respect. The students no longer saw a small clawless being before them. They saw the shadow of a world where every living thing was forged in unity, a world that had shaped humanity itself into something they could not yet understand. The teacher bowed his head in respect, and the hall followed his gesture. The question had been asked, the law of the pack had been revealed, and though the lesson was not yet done, it had already carved itself into the hearts of every predator present. And in that silence they understood that the human was not speaking only of beasts, he was speaking of his own kind, and that truth was far more dangerous than they had yet realized. The hall remained wrapped in silence after the words of the human about the law of the pack, yet the question in every young predator's heart grew larger, for they had heard about wolves and lions and wild dogs. But what of the humans themselves? Were they too bound by the same rule, or did they follow a path different from beasts? The teacher raised his head and asked this question aloud, and every eye turned once more toward the human, who stood still with a gaze like stone. The human did not speak at once. Instead, he walked toward the great circle at the center of the hall, his steps echoing softly across the smooth floor. And when he stood in the circle, he lifted his hand and pointed at his own chest. In the beginning, he said, we were the weakest of them all, smaller than the beast, slower than the hunter, softer than the prey. Our skin tore our bones, broke our children, were helpless, and the night swallowed us with ease. The students leaned closer, their pride and arrogance shaken by the thought of a creature so weak surviving in a world that sounded like a storm without end. The human's voice carried on, calm but filled with weight. Every beast was stronger than us, every claw sharper, every fang deadlier. Yet we did not vanish, because we obeyed the law of the pack more than any other. We gathered together, we shared warmth, we shared food, we guarded the fire as one, and with that fire we pushed back the dark. The young predators could almost see it in their minds, a tribe of fragile humans sitting in the shadow of a great fire, their bodies thin and weak, yet their eyes sharp with thought and unity. One hunter keeping watch, one hunter feeding the flame, one hunter guarding the young, and together they endured the storm that would have broken them alone. The human raised both hands as if shaping an invisible weapon. In the air we made tools, from stone we made spears, from wood we tied sharp edges with sinew. And we did not do this alone, we did this together, one shaping the stone, one cutting the wood, one binding them tight. And when we hunted the great beasts, we did not chase them in pride, we circled them, we trapped them, we called to one another, with hands, with voices, with signals of smoke and shadow. The students felt their chests tighten, for in their worlds one hunter was enough. Yet here was a being without claws or fangs, striking down giants, with nothing but sticks and fire, because many had stood as one. The thought carried fear into their hearts, but also awe. The human's eyes grew darker as he spoke of battles not against beasts, but against the earth itself, rivers and flood storms tearing through the land, winters that froze the air to stone. None of these could be faced alone, but with many together. Shelters were built, fires burned through the night, and tribes walked across the white lands, leaving no one behind. A young predator with green eyes spoke suddenly, his voice filled with doubt. But if you were so weak, Why did stronger beasts not end you? The human turned, and his answer came swift. Because no beast hunted only one of us. When it struck one, it faced many. When it clawed one, it was surrounded. When it tried to feast, it was driven back by fire and stone and unity. Even the fiercest saber, cat, even the largest bear learned that one human meant many humans, and many meant death for any beast. The whisper spread through the hall like fire in dry grass. To fight one is to fight them all. The young predators looked at one another and felt the truth in their bones, for the human before them stood not as one, but as the shadow of countless voices, behind him the shadow of tribe and kin, and blood bound together by the law of the pack. The human's voice softened now, yet each word struck harder. We survived not because of strength, but because of unity. We endured not because of claws, but because of fire and memory. We grew not because of pride, but because we lifted each other and learned together. The beasts that stood alone were stronger than us, yet they vanished. While we endured, the beasts that followed only pride fell into the dust. While we built tribes and nations, the students felt their hearts beat faster, their pride wounded, yet their thoughts reshaped, for they had believed that solitude was honor. But the human showed them that solitude was death, that unity was life, and that humanity had risen above every beast, because they followed this law more than any other. The teacher bowed his head in understanding. His old voice spoke low. This is why your kind has spread among the stars, because you never walk alone. The human nodded, his face calm and unreadable, and he replied, even in the void of space, we are never alone. We carry our kin, our tribes, our nations. In every step we take, no human stands as one, for every human carries the strength of many. The hall trembled with the weight of that truth. Some young predators lowered their heads in respect, others clenched their claws in fear. But none could deny what they had heard. The human had shown them not only the weakness of his kind, but the strength that weakness had forged into something far greater than any single claw or fang. The human then told them of great hunts across the ages, how tribes worked together to drive mammoths into traps, how they chased herds for days, with every runner taking turns until the prey collapsed from exhaustion, how they built walls of fire to corner beasts that no single hunter could ever face. And with each story, the students saw that the human was not boasting. He was teaching, showing them that humanity itself was the greatest pack to ever walk the earth. One young predator whispered that such unity was unnatural, but the human turned and answered coldly, unnatural perhaps to you, but to us it is the only natural way, because we are born fragile, we are born weak, we are born in need of one another, and from that need we became more powerful than all who stood alone. The whisper of fear grew deeper in the hall. The young predators now saw clearly what it meant. If even the weakest could rise through unity, then what power did humanity hold when they carried that same law into the stars? The teacher's voice came soft yet heavy. With all the law of the pack shaped beasts into hunters, it shaped humans into something greater. The human gave no reply. He simply lowered his gaze, letting the silence speak. Once more the silence, filled with the shadows of firelit nights and the cries of tribes standing together against the dark, the silence that told every predator in that hall that the answer to the question had only just begun. And in that silence they felt it, the truth, that on earth no predator hunts alone, and that in humanity this truth had become something far beyond survival. It had become destiny. The air in the hall grew heavy after the human's final words, and the young predators shifted in silence, some filled with awe, some filled with doubt, their claws tapping against the floor, tails twitching in unrest. And then one among them, a tall student with scales that shimmered like polished bronze, rose to his feet, his voice sharp and full of pride. He laughed loud and bold, shaking his head at the human's lesson. Weakness, he said, you speak only of weakness. If a hunter cannot stand alone, then it does not deserve to live. Strength is the right of the predator, and those who cannot claim it should vanish from the earth. His words echoed through the hall like the crack of stone, and many students hissed in approval, their pride rekindled by his challenge. The human turned his head slowly toward the bronze-scaled student, his expression calm, his eyes sharp and deep. No anger showed on his face, no smile either, only a cold quiet that cut sharper than any roar. The bronze-scaled predator stood tall, his chest wide with arrogance, and for a moment the hall believed the human had been defeated with words. Then the human stepped forward, his voice steady and low, but filled with weight that pressed against the hearts of all. Listen, he said, and I will tell you of the leopard. The hall grew quiet again, for there was something in the human's voice that froze every whisper, every hiss, every laugh. He spoke not with pride, but with memory, as if his words carried the weight of blood and bone from long ago. The students leaned close, their eyes wide, their ears sharp, for the story of the leopard was about to be told. The leopard, he said, is swift and strong. It climbs trees. With ease it strikes, with speed it hunts alone with pride, and it believes that its strength makes it greater than all other beasts. For a time it succeeds, it catches prey in silence, it drags its kill into branches, it rules the shadows with grace and fury. But one day the leopard meets the pack of wild dogs, lean, small, hungry, yet many they move. As one they surround the leopard, their teeth snapping, their bodies weaving in and out. The leopard slashes, with claws it bites, with fangs it leaps into the air, but wherever it strikes it finds only one, while the many close in. The student sat frozen. The bronze-scaled challenger frowned, but did not speak. The human's voice pressed deeper. The leopard believes in its strength. It believes it needs no ally, no partner, no kin, but the pack does not strike alone. Each dog fights with the others, each tooth joins the rest, and though the leopard is stronger, it cannot strike them all. It cannot face every angle, it cannot fight the endless unity, and so the leopard falls, torn by the many against the one. A chill moved through the hall as the young predators imagined it, the proud hunter, shredded by those at once dismissed as lesser. The bronze-scaled student opened his mouth to protest, but no words came, for even he could see the truth in the human's tale. The human's eyes narrowed, and his voice fell into a whisper that carried more fear than any roar. Pride without unity is death, he said. Strength without allies is weakness in disguise. The leopard learned this too late, and so it vanished into the teeth of the pack. The teacher of the hall bowed his head slightly, his old eyes fixed on the human. He understood the lesson, though many of the students still struggled to accept it. The young, who had been raised to believe that solitude was honor, now saw it crumble before them. The bronze-scaled student sat down slowly, his head lowered, his pride broken not by insult, but by truth carved into him, by the tale of the leopard. The hall was still silent, and in that silence every predator thought of its own strength, its own pride, and wondered if it too would fall before the many, if it too was only a leopard waiting for the pack. The human walked back toward the center of the hall, his voice rising once more. Earth is filled with mistakes, like the leopard. Beasts who thought they were beyond the law, beasts who believed their pride greater than the storm, but all of them fell, and only those who obeyed the pack endured. We humans saw their fall, and we remembered their lesson. We carved it into our bones, we carried it in our blood, we built our tribes upon it. He lifted his hand and pointed at the students one by one, his gaze sharp and unyielding. Alone you are hunters, yes, alone you are strong, yes, but strength fades, hunger grows, storms rise, rivers flood, enemies strike, and when they do, the lone hunter falls, while the pack stands. When the storm passes, the lone is gone, the pack remains. The students lowered their eyes, some in shame, some in thought, some in fear, for the words had struck too deep to deny. The human had shown them that pride alone was a mistake that earth itself had crushed again and again, until only unity remained. The teacher spoke in a slow voice, heavy with respect. This is why humanity endures. This is why no predator hunts alone on earth, because the world has no mercy for the arrogant and no pity for the proud. The human nodded, his gaze still fixed upon the crowd, and his silence carried the weight of storms and shadows. The hall remained frozen in that silence, the lesson carved deep, the story of the leopard burned into memory. None of them would forget it, for it was not simply about a beast of earth. It was about themselves. It was about the mistake that all predators risked when they chose pride over unity. And as the silence grew longer, they began to understand that the human's answer was not only about Earth, it was about the stars as well, because if humanity carried the law of the pack beyond the forests and into the void, then no predator, no matter how strong, could ever stand against them alone. The silence in the hall stretched long after the tale of the leopard, and the wild dogs, the young predators, sat with their claws, folded their tails, curled their eyes dark and thoughtful. They had entered the day believing pride was strength and solitude was glory, yet the human had torn that belief apart with words sharper than any blade. The teacher said nothing, for he too was watching and waiting, his old gaze fixed upon the figure standing calm in the circle. The human did not rush, his voice did not rise in anger. He simply stood with the stillness of stone until the weight of silence pressed against every heart. Then he spoke again, his tone steady, low and certain. Earth is not only a place of beasts and storms. Earth is a teacher, and its lesson is written in blood and shadow. Those who forget the law of the pack fall to the earth. Those who keep it rise above it. The students leaned forward, their ears straining, their eyes locked upon him. The human continued, "Alone a hunter may take prey, but alone it cannot last. Alone it may fight, but it cannot endure. Every storm is larger, every danger sharper, every shadow filled with teeth. But together the pack survives, together the pack endures, together the pack does more than live, it rules." The hall stirred with unease as his words pressed deeper, for they understood now that this law was not just about animals or weaklings. It was about something far greater. The human raised his hand and drew an invisible circle in the air. "This is the deeper truth," he said. "The law of the pack is not only survival, it is preparation. Those who learn it are forged into something stronger than themselves. Alone it is the seed that grows into more than survival. It grows into tribe, into clan, into people, into nation." The word nation rolled through the hall like thunder. The students frowned, for they had no such concept. Their worlds had hunters, their worlds had prides and rivals, but not this strange thing that bound many together under one name, one voice, one will. The human's eyes grew sharp, and his voice carried fire. "We humans were weak, we were fragile, yet by the law of the pack, we became more than hunters. We became armies, we became builders, we became a storm that no single beast, no single tribe could ever stop." A young predator with dark scales hissed softly, daring to raise his voice. "What you speak of sounds like war." The human turned to him and nodded slowly. "Yes, war, but also life. War against beast, war against storm, war against hunger. And when other tribes came against us, we stood not as one, but as many, bound by the same blood, bound by the same fire, bound by the same law." The students exchanged uneasy glances, their pride twisting, their fear growing. They had thought strength was in the single claw, the single tooth, but the human was showing them that strength was something else, something greater than they had ever known. He stepped closer, his eyes fixed upon the rows of young hunters. "When you fight one human, you fight them all. When you strike one, you awaken many. When you face one, you face the shadow of 1,000 behind him." The words struck like blades into their hearts. Some clenched their fists, some lowered their eyes, some trembled, though they tried to hide it. The human's voice pressed harder. "This is the deeper truth. No predator on earth hunts alone, not because they cannot, but because they are shaped by a world that kills the proud and raises the united. It is in the bones of every wolf, it is in the roar of every lion, and in us it became something far greater than survival. It became destiny." The teacher lowered his head in respect. The old predator felt the weight of centuries in those words. He whispered softly, so that the hall could hear, "Humanity carries the pack beyond earth into the stars." The human nodded once, his gaze still firm. "We do not forget the law. We cannot forget it. It is carved into our flesh and memory. It is the reason we walk here before you. It is the reason we did not die in the dark long ago. It is the reason we are feared by those who know." The young predators felt the truth settle like stone upon them. Their pride could not rise against it, for they had seen the shadow of the leopard torn by the many. They had seen the tribe of humans rising from weakness into strength. And now they saw the vision of armies moving like packs, nations rising like prides that spanned continents. Unity turned into power far beyond the hunt. The human's voice softened now, but it carried more weight than before. "Some of you believe pride is your greatest weapon. Some of you believe solitude makes you strong. But hear this, the lone hunter falls, the lone predator dies, the lone warrior breaks, but the pack endures, the pack remembers, the pack grows, the pack becomes more than hunters, the pack becomes history." The students bowed their heads, some in shame, some in fear, some in awe. The bronze-scaled student, who had once mocked the human, now sat still, his claws folded, his eyes lowered, for he knew that his words of pride had been broken by truth. The human turned slowly and looked once more through the great window where the stars burned cold and endless. He raised his hand toward them. "When we left Earth, we carried the law with us. We carried it into the void, into the ships that crossed the black, into the colonies that rose on alien soil. Every step was taken together, every danger faced together, and so we endured where others fell." A shiver ran through the hall. The young predators now understood why humanity was different, why no predator on Earth hunts alone. The law of the pack had shaped them, not only to survive their world, but to survive all worlds. The teacher finally spoke, his voice low but clear. "Students, remember this lesson. The question has been answered. The truth revealed. The pride of solitude is a mask. Behind it lies death. The power of unity is the path. Behind it lies life. The human has shown us what Earth has written, and we would be blind to deny it." The hall bowed in silence, and the human lowered his hand once more. He gave no smile, no triumph, only the quiet of one who has spoken the truth, and left it to settle like fire in dry grass. He turned from the window, his face unreadable, but his silence carried the weight of storms and shadows. And in that silence the young predators felt something new, not only fear, but respect, not only awe, but understanding. They saw that the human was not speaking only for himself. He was speaking for a world that had carved unity into every living thing. He was speaking for a people who carried that law into the stars and would never forget it. The deeper truth had been revealed, and it could not be unlearned. The hall was no longer restless. The young predators, who once hissed and laughed, now sat frozen, their eyes wide, their breaths low, their claws unmoving against the stone floor. The words of the human had carved deep into their thoughts, and every whisper of pride had turned to silence. The teacher stood, still, his old frame heavy with understanding, his gaze lowered in respect, for he knew that a truth this sharp could not be ignored. The human stood calm in the center of the circle, his hands at his sides, his eyes steady on the crowd. No roar, no gesture, no violence, only stillness. And yet that stillness pressed harder than any storm. The young predators felt it like weight upon their shoulders. They looked at him and saw not one figure, not one fragile being, but the shadow of many, the shape of tribes and armies and nations walking behind his calm face. A young predator with silver scales tried to raise his head, tried to speak, but no sound came from his throat. The words he wanted to use were gone, swallowed by fear and awe. He lowered his eyes and stayed silent. The rest of the students did the same, their tails curled, their pride broken, their thoughts reshaped. The teacher finally lifted his voice, his tone soft, yet firm. This lesson will not leave you, he said. You will remember it. When you hunt, when you fight, when you walk into the storms of your own worlds, you will remember that pride alone is death and unity is life. You will remember what the human has spoken, and you will understand why his kind has risen beyond the stars. The young predators bowed their heads. None dared to argue, none dared to laugh, none dared to question, for the silence around them was heavier than iron and sharper than any fang. The human had given them the truth and left it to burn inside their hearts. The human then stepped slowly toward the great doors of the hall, his movements calm, his pace steady, every step echoing like thunder across the stone. Each sound reminded the predators that he was real, that he was here, that he was not only words, but flesh, carrying the law of the pack in his very bones and blood. He did not turn to look back. He did not raise his voice. He walked as if the silence itself was his answer. The students watched him go, their breaths held, their eyes wide. They felt something they had never felt before toward any being, not fear of strength, not fear of claws, not fear of death, but fear of unity, the kind of fear that told them one human was never alone, that one shadow carried many, that one voice carried countless echoes. When the human reached the door, he stopped for a moment. He placed his hand against the cold surface of the metal, and he spoke one last time, his voice soft, yet reaching every corner of the hall. On earth, no predator hunts alone, and that is why we are still here. His words drifted through the air like smoke, and then he pushed open the door and walked into the light beyond, leaving the hall in silence deeper than any void. The teacher closed his eyes and let the silence remain. He did not call the class to order. He did not speak further, for he knew the lesson had already ended. He knew that nothing he could add would weigh as heavy as the silence that followed the human's departure. The young predators remained seated, some staring at the empty space where the human had stood, some looking at their own claws and wondering if they were truly weapons, some remembering the tale of the leopard torn apart by the many others, imagining tribes of humans driving beasts into fire and shadow until they fell. None moved, for the silence bound them like chains. The bronze-scaled student who had once mocked the human now bowed his head low, his pride shattered not by insult, but by truth. His claws clenched against the stone floor, not in defiance, but in shame, for he knew that his words had been broken. He had believed in the lone claw, the lone fang, but now he saw it for what it was, a mistake waiting for death. The silver-scaled student lifted his eyes again and whispered softly, not to anyone in particular, but to himself, "To fight one is to fight them all." His voice trembled, but his words were true, and the hall heard them, though none replied, for they all knew the truth was already carved inside them. The teacher at last opened his eyes and looked upon his students. "You came here to learn," he said, "and you have learned more than you expected. Remember this day, for it will guide you when your pride tempts you, when your solitude whispers to you, when your strength deceives. You remember the silence, remember the human, remember the law of the pack." The young predators lowered their heads, once more their silence, an unspoken oath, for none could deny what they had seen and heard. None could return to the comfort of their old beliefs. They would carry this lesson into their hunts, into their battles, into their lives. The law of the pack would follow them. Though they might resist, though they might hide it deep, it would remain like fire smoldering in dry wood. Beyond the hall, the human walked through the wide paths of the alien academy, his steps steady, his eyes forward. He did not smile. He did not boast. He simply moved with the same calm that had filled the hall. He knew the silence he left behind was greater than any roar, greater than any victory, for silence held the truth, and the truth needed no defense. The stars above burned cold and endless, and the human lifted his gaze to them. For a moment he saw not distance, but memory. He saw the tribes around fire. He saw the wolves circling prey. He saw the lions striking together. He saw the storms that had broken the weak and raised the strong. He saw the truth of earth, and he carried it forward into the void. Back in the hall, the students slowly began to rise one by one. None spoke, their faces heavy, their eyes dark with thought. The teacher watched them go, his heart filled with a strange mix of fear and respect. He knew they would never be the same again. He knew the silence of this day would follow them long after they had left his class, long after they had faced their own storms. And so the story of the question ended, not with laughter, not with defiance, not with pride, but with silence, the stunned silence of hunters who had seen the deeper truth and could no longer pretend it was not there, a silence that carried the shadow of wolves and lions and humans who never walked alone, a silence that whispered the fate of the lone and the destiny of the pack. In that silence, the law of the pack had crossed the stars and rooted itself in hearts that once believed in solitude and now trembled before unity.